The crack came first, a sickening snap that tore up through my bones and into my skull. Then the crushing force of my father's boot drove straight into my shin. The pain detonated in white-hot shards, ripping the air from my lungs. My leg buckled before I even knew I was falling. Then the floor slammed into me hard, the carpet burning my palms as I tried to catch myself. My vision swam black at the edges. The pounding in my ears drowned out everything except the low rasp of his breathing above me. Frank loomed close, his shadow slicing across my face. His voice was flat, cold. "That is what you get for defying me." The words landed like another blow. My leg screamed with every heartbeat, the angle of my foot grotesque, twisted away from where it should be. I knew something deep inside had snapped. The throbbing radiated upward to my hip, sharp, relentless, my stomach clenching until bile rose in my throat. The air smelled faintly of coffee from the kitchen. It turned sour in my nose when I saw Janet leaning on the counter, eyes fixed on me without a flicker of alarm. Mark lounged at the table, a smirk curling like he had been waiting for this moment. I clawed at the floor, dragging myself an inch, then another. Each movement sent lightning bolts through my leg, a raw cry ripping from my throat before I could bite it back. My father didn't move to help. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides, watching, making sure I absorbed the lesson. "You think you can tell me no?" His tone was slow, deliberate, each word heavy enough to press the air from the room. My chest ached as I gasped. My hands shook with more than pain. In that moment, the betrayal cut sharper than the bone that had snapped. The man who should have protected me had broken me instead. The man my mother still stood beside, the man my brother still admired. My tears blurred his face, but I forced my gaze to stay locked on him. I wanted him to see that even wrecked on the floor, I wasn't gone. Not yet. Not this time. I grew up in a small Ohio town where the houses sat in neat rows, lawns, clipped short and white picket fences standing like polite guards between neighbors, the kind of place where people waved from their porches and knew each other's birthdays. But what went on inside our two-story house was kept behind a door that shut firmly at night. On the outside, my family looked solid. Frank, my father, ran a local hardware store and could talk tools and hunting with any man in town, my mother. Janet kept the house immaculate and always had a polite smile ready for church on Sundays, and my older brother Mark was the golden boy everyone admired. Inside, the reality was a strict hierarchy that revolved around Frank's authority and Mark's comfort. I was at the bottom not because of anything I had done, but because from the time I could form memories, it was clear my place was to adapt to obey and to absorb the blame when it was convenient. Frank wasn't the kind of father who raised his voice often. When he did, it was controlled, measured, and left no room for argument. But most of the time, his authority was enforced in smaller ways, a look that warned me to stay quiet, a command phrased as if it were a fact of nature, a hand on my shoulder that felt more like a weight than a comfort. Janet played her role with precision. She smoothed over any visible conflict, redirected conversations if I tried to speak up, and never once challenged Frank's decisions in front of me. If Mark wanted something, he got it even if it was mine. If I needed something, it was often met with a lecture about independence, or a reminder that Mark had earned more. At school, teachers praised my grades, my projects, my quiet discipline. At home, these were invisible, swallowed by whatever Mark had done that day. When he won a small-town football trophy, it sat on the mantel for years. When I received a regional science award, Janet tucked the certificate in a drawer. Frank liked order, but not the kind that came from fairness. His order was about control, and control meant knowing that no matter what happened outside, inside the house, his word was final. There were rules, some spoken, many unspoken. Dinner was served at 6, Frank at the head of the table, Mark to his right, me to his left, Janet at the far end. Conversation centered on Mark's achievements, Frank's business, or Janet's social calendar. If I spoke out of turn, there was a pause, a glance, and then the subject would shift as if I hadn't said anything at all. This dynamic seeped into everything. When I was a child, I tried harder thinking maybe if I could be more helpful or more impressive, they would see me. By the time I was a teenager, I understood that visibility came with a cost I couldn't afford. It was easier to be quiet to become background. Mark, older by 2 years, learned quickly how to leverage this. He could be charming in public, respectful to Frank's face, and then turn sharp in private, reminding me of my place with a word or a shove. Janet defended him reflexively, claiming I must have misunderstood that siblings fight, that I was too sensitive. Frank didn't bother defending him with words. He didn't have to, his silence was permission enough. Our home's warmth was for display, switched on like the porch light for company, and switched off once the door closed. In winter, the living room glowed with the yellow light of the fireplace when guests visited, but on quiet nights I sat in my room with the hum of the furnace and the muffled sound of Frank's voice carrying down the hall, steady and absolute. I learned early that peace was fragile and dependent on keeping Frank's mood steady. If he was tired from work or Mark was in trouble, the air in the house grew heavy, every sound sharper. Janet moved carefully in those moments. I moved quietly, hoping to avoid drawing notice. The years built layers of understanding that I carried silently. Frank's approval was conditional and rare. Janet's loyalty was to him first. Mark's needs were the center of the family's orbit, and mine were negotiable. By the time I left for college, the distance was a relief, the first real breath of independence I'd had. But even from miles away, the dynamic reached me in calls that were less about how I was doing and more about what I could do for them. When I returned home for holidays, it was as if I'd stepped back into a role I hadn't agreed to play. My voice smaller, my choices questioned, my accomplishments quietly dismissed. That imbalance so normal to them became the air I breathed without realizing it. It shaped how I measured my own worth and how I learned to live in the spaces left to me. It is impossible to understand what happened the night Frank's boot met my shin without knowing this history, without seeing how the ground had been laid year after year for the moment when his authority and my refusal finally collided. By the time I was old enough to recognize patterns, the imbalance in our house had already taken root so deep it felt like part of the walls, as if the creak on the third stair or the faint smell of coffee in the mornings was tied to the way Frank's authority settled over everything and the way Mark's needs always came before mine. Childhood moments that might have been small to anyone else became markers for me. At 12, Frank slapped me hard across the face because I accidentally spilled water on the kitchen floor, the sting lingering in my cheek long after he'd gone back to reading the newspaper. At 14, Mark shoved me into the hallway wall so hard I felt the breath leave my body, then grinned when Janet came out of the bedroom and told me to stop making drama. Frank called it discipline. Janet called it normal sibling rivalry. I called it the moment I realized my pain was negotiable in this family. There were other incidents less visible, but just as sharp. The time Frank kicked the back of my leg when I hesitated to hand over my savings for a school trip, telling me to stop hoarding. The time Mark borrowed my laptop for weeks and returned it broken, and Frank told me I should have been more careful with my belongings. Each time I thought maybe if I told the truth exactly as it happened, someone would see me, but each time it was turned back on me. I was too sensitive, too stubborn, too unwilling to forgive. The result was a constant calculation in my head: how to move through the house without drawing attention, how to speak without sparking a look from Frank that warned me to stop, how to measure the air in the room before deciding if it was safe to sit at the table or better to take my plate to my room. Mark thrived in this environment. He learned quickly that charm in public and quiet cruelty in private could coexist without consequence, and Frank seemed to admire it. Janet's role was to smooth over any visible tension, often by redirecting blame toward me. If Mark took something of mine, she would ask why I hadn't been more generous. If Frank raised his voice, she would tell me not to provoke him. Over time, I understood that nothing I did could earn the position Mark had been handed at birth. When I reached high school, the pattern only deepened. I brought home straight A's, but Frank barely glanced at my report card while Mark's passing grades earned a celebratory dinner. I won a regional debate award. Janet mentioned it briefly before launching into a story about Mark's upcoming football game. Every dismissal was a quiet cut, and they built on each other until I carried them like weight in my chest. At 16, Mark twisted my wrist in the living room because I wouldn't change the TV channel. The bruise lasted for days, but Frank handed me an ice pack and told me it would heal. I stopped trying to involve them when something hurt me. The outcome was always the same. This was the foundation I carried into adulthood, the reason why even after I moved into my own apartment, I still heard Frank's voice in my head whenever I made a decision he might disapprove of, the reason why my guard never dropped completely around family. I thought distance might weaken their hold. Instead, it changed form. Calls from Janet were laced with questions about my finances or thinly veiled suggestions to help Mark. Visits home were performances with me slipping back into a smaller version of myself the moment I walked through the door. I had friends who noticed the difference in me around my family. I laughed less, deferred more, spoke cautiously. I told them it was just how we were, but the truth was simpler and harder. I had been trained to exist in the shadow of someone else's comfort. This is what makes the night of the boot so inevitable in my mind. It wasn't an isolated act of rage. It was the culmination of years where Frank's control was unchecked, where my resistance was rare, and where any defiance was seen not as independence, but as rebellion to be punished. When I look back, I can see the path clearly, each bruise and each dismissal, another step toward that moment in the living room when I finally told him no, and his answer was not words, but force. Not negotiation, but the sound of bone snapping under his foot, a sound I will never forget. The spark that lit the fuse came months before Frank's boot ever met my leg. I had finally saved enough for a down payment on a small apartment, nothing fancy, but it was mine, bought with years of double shifts and nights spent clipping coupons instead of going out. When I told my parents, Janet offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Frank gave a short nod, and Mark didn't say anything at all. 2 days later, Janet called to tell me Mark's lease was ending and it would make sense for him to move into my second bedroom. She spoke as if it was already decided, her tone brisk the way she talked when she wanted to leave no room for argument. I told her I had plans for that room as a workspace and a place for occasional guests. There was a pause, then a cool, "We'll talk about it later." We did talk later, but it wasn't a discussion. Frank called that night, his voice low and firm, telling me family comes first, that it was selfish to let space sit empty while my brother was struggling. I held my ground and the line went silent before he muttered, "You'll regret this," and hung up. After that, the pressure was steady. Mark posted vague comments online about selfish people who forget who helped them when they had nothing. Janet dropped comments in every call about how lucky I was to have so much space. Frank started sending me messages about opportunities to make things right. I avoided family dinners knowing it would come up, but when Janet invited me to her birthday, I said yes out of obligation. The night of the dinner, the house felt like it always had warm lights, the smell of roast beef, but the undercurrent was sharp. Mark was already at the table when I arrived, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place. Frank at the head, Janet moving between kitchen and dining room with the same controlled efficiency she always had. At first, conversation was polite, even pleasant, but halfway through dessert, Mark steered it to my apartment. "It's ridiculous," he said, "one person in all that space while your own family needs a place." Janet nodded slightly without looking at me. Frank's eyes fixed on my face, waiting. I set my fork down and said evenly that I had worked for my home, that it was mine to decide, that I wasn't responsible for solving Mark's problems. The shift in the room was instant. Mark's smirk flattened. Janet's movement slowed. Frank's jaw tightened. Mark leaned forward, his voice dripping contempt, accusing me of caring more about my furniture than my brother's future. I could feel the weight of their expectation pressing down on me, the unspoken demand to yield, but I kept my tone calm and said no. Frank's eyes narrowed, and in that split second I saw the change, the coil winding tight inside him. He pushed back his chair with deliberate slowness, stood, and walked around the table toward me. I thought he might yell, slam his fist, but instead he stopped in front of me close enough for me to smell the bitter coffee on his breath, and in one swift motion he swung his boot into my shin with a force that sent a shockwave up my leg. I heard the crack before the pain hit sharp and absolute, stealing my breath. My hands gripped the edge of the table, trying to stay upright, but the second kick took me down the carpet, rushing up Mark's chair, scraping back as he stood to watch Janet frozen in place. My vision tunneled the sounds in the room, muffled except for Frank's breathing and the pounding of my own heartbeat, and in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about the apartment. It was every refusal I had ever dared every time I had stepped out of line condensed into the brutal language of bone and force. The night of Janet's birthday had started under a brittle truce, but the moment Frank's boot connected with my shin, that truce shattered into jagged edges. The first blow was a deep, blunt force that made my stomach lurch. The second was worse, landing higher, the crack ripping through the air and into my bones like a lightning strike. Pain surged so fast it was almost blinding. My leg folded, my knees buckled, and I hit the floor hard, the carpet rough under my palms as I tried to brace, but the damage was done. My breath came in short, ragged bursts. I could feel heat blooming under the skin, the wrong angle of my foot making my stomach turn. Frank loomed over me, his voice a low growl, telling me this was what happened when I forgot my place. His words pressed down on me as much as his blows had. They were a verdict, final and unapologetic. I looked toward Janet, hoping for a flicker of concern, but she stood by the counter, her hands gripping its edge, her face unreadable except for the faint crease between her brows that told me she was calculating, deciding if this was worth acknowledging. Mark was on his feet now, leaning forward slightly, his smirk gone, but his eyes bright, almost entertained. I tried to shift to sit up, but the motion sent a spear of pain shooting through my leg. The sound that escaped me was raw and unguarded. "Call an ambulance," I managed to say, my voice breaking, but Frank shook his head, his tone flat as stone. "You'll be fine. Stop being dramatic." The absurdity of that sentence in the face of the pain almost broke something else inside me, but then another wave of it hit, and I could barely think. Janet finally moved her voice low as she said, "I guess we should take her to urgent care." There was no rush in her steps, no urgency in Frank's slow movement as he bent to pull me to my feet. His grip on my arm was perfunctory, like guiding a stranger. Mark stayed where he was watching as Frank half-dragged me toward the door. The drive was silent, the hum of the tires over the road, punctuated only by my occasional hiss of pain when we hit a bump. At urgent care, the nurse's eyes widened at the sight of my leg, already swelling bruises blooming dark under the skin. She called for x-rays immediately. Frank stood with his arms crossed, saying nothing, while Janet filled out paperwork without meeting my eyes. When the doctor came back with the results, his tone was clinical but sharp. "You have a fracture in your tibia. You'll need a cast and several weeks of recovery. You're lucky it didn't break through the skin." He asked how it happened. Before I could answer, Frank spoke, his voice smooth. "She tripped." The doctor's eyes flicked to me, then back to Frank. He didn't challenge the story, but the nurse lingered, her expression skeptical. She asked quietly if I wanted to file a report. The room seemed to still around the question. I hesitated, feeling the weight of every past incident pressing down the years of being told to keep the peace, the knowledge that if I said yes, it would explode the fragile image my family kept polished for the world. Frank's voice cut in before I could speak. "No report. It was an accident." I saw the nurse's mouth tighten, but she said nothing more, just noted something on her clipboard. They wrapped my leg in a temporary splint, prescribed pain medication, and gave me a list of follow-up appointments. Back at the house, Frank didn't help me inside. He pulled to the curb, said, "Take care of yourself," and drove off with Janet in the passenger seat. Mark's silhouette was still visible through the dining room window, moving around the table like nothing had happened. I hobbled inside just long enough to grab my bag, ignoring the throbbing in my leg, and called a cab to take me back to my apartment. The ride was a blur of streetlights and pain, each turn jarring my injury. Alone in my living room later that night, propped up on pillows, I replayed every second of it, the way Frank had stood over me, the cold satisfaction in his eyes, the emptiness in Janet's face, the stillness in Mark's body as he watched. It was the culmination of years of being treated as an afterthought, a problem to be managed rather than a daughter to be cared for. The physical pain was sharp and immediate, but underneath it was something colder, heavier, the realization that if I stayed silent again, I was telling them they could do this to me without consequence, and for the first time, the spark of defiance burned hotter than the fear. By morning, the bruises had deepened into dark purples and blacks. The skin around my shin stretched tight over swelling that made every movement feel like a fresh wave of fire. Each time I shifted in bed, the ache flared, sharp and insistent, reminding me of the moment the bone gave way. Sunlight cut across the room, catching on the bottle of painkillers the urgent care doctor had prescribed, and for a long time I just stared at it, thinking about how many times I had woken up hurting because of Frank, and how many times I had convinced myself it wasn't worth making a scene. This was different. This wasn't a shove in passing or a slap during an argument. This was calculated force meant to hurt, and my leg was the proof. I picked up my phone and called Laura, my closest friend since high school. The concern in her voice was immediate, and within an hour she was at my apartment, arms full of groceries and a stack of ready-to-heat meals. When she saw my leg, her jaw tightened, her eyes scanning the mottled bruises and the awkward angle of the temporary splint. "Sarah, this isn't just an argument," she said quietly. "This is assault." She asked if I had the medical records, and I told her they had given me a copy along with the x-rays. She told me to keep everything together in one place, to take photos of my leg every day to document the healing. I felt a strange mix of gratitude and shame. Gratitude because she was here and on my side. Shame because a part of me still wondered if I was overreacting, just like my parents always told me I did. Laura seemed to read my thoughts. "You're not exaggerating. This is serious and you know it." That night, unable to sleep, I scrolled through Ohio's assault laws, reading about how serious bodily harm could elevate a charge to felony assault. 2 broken bones qualified. The more I read, the more I realized how much I had let them all convince me my safety wasn't worth fighting for. I thought about calling Frank or Janet, but I could already hear their voices, could already predict how it would go. They would defend Mark if it suited them. They would defend Frank no matter what they would tell me. I provoked him, and they would try to wear me down until I dropped it. But I also thought about the way Frank had dismissed me at urgent care, the way Janet had hesitated before even suggesting we go the way Mark had just stood there watching. That wasn't protection. That was damage control for the family image. I decided to call a lawyer instead. Laura found one through a friend who specialized in domestic assault cases. His name was Peter, and he agreed to meet me the following week. In the meantime, Laura checked in daily, and a neighbor helped carry groceries up to my second-floor apartment. Their care only highlighted the contrast with my family's absence. Not a single call from Frank or Janet, not a single text from Mark. I suspected they were all waiting for me to just get over it, to let it fade into another unspoken injury. But as I sat with the slow ache in my leg and the stack of evidence on my kitchen table, I knew I wasn't going to. This time, there would be a record. This time, there would be consequences. Meeting Peter was not what I expected. I thought I would feel small in his office, like I was asking for something I didn't deserve, but instead, he made it clear from the start that what happened to me was criminal, not some petty family disagreement. He listened without interrupting as I told him everything from the first phone call about Mark moving into the dinner to the moment Frank's boot broke my leg. When I finished, he asked to see the photos and the medical records. His eyes narrowed when he saw the x-rays, the clean fracture lines cutting across the dark film. "This isn't just assault," he said. "This is aggravated assault with intent to cause serious harm." He explained that because it happened in a domestic setting, the court could classify it under domestic violence statutes, which carried harsher penalties. I felt a strange surge of both validation and fear. Validation because someone was finally naming it for what it was. Fear because I knew what it would mean to take this public. Peter asked if I was ready for the fallout, said that cases like this often brought out the worst in families, that people picked sides, and sometimes the victim became the target all over again. I told him I had been living that reality for years, and he nodded before outlining the plan file, a police report backed by the medical evidence request, a protective order, and prepare for the possibility of testifying. The thought of going to the police made my stomach knot. But Peter assured me he would handle the legal framing. My job was to tell the truth exactly as it happened. The next day, Laura drove me to the station. The officer who took my statement read through Peter's prepared summary, then listened as I described the attack in my own words. He didn't rush me, didn't smirk or sigh like Frank always did when I tried to explain something painful. He just wrote it all down and asked if I wanted to press charges. I said yes without hesitation, and that single word felt like reclaiming something I had lost years ago. Peter moved quickly after that. He filed for a protective order and notified the court that we intended to pursue charges. Within a week, Frank was served with a summons, and I heard through a cousin that he exploded when he read it, shouting that I was destroying the family. Janet called once, leaving a voicemail about how ashamed she was that I would air private family matters in public. I didn't call back. Mark sent a text telling me to think about the long-term consequences. I ignored it. The truth was, I had already thought about the long term, and I had decided I would rather be cut off entirely than keep living as their silent target. Peter began preparing me for the possibility of testifying. He said Frank's lawyer would try to paint me as overdramatic or suggest that the injury was an accident. That night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror practicing saying, "He broke my leg with a kick, and I have the x-rays to prove it." I said it until my voice didn't shake. In the quiet of my apartment, I realized I wasn't just building a legal case. I was building a version of myself they couldn't touch anymore. The more I prepared, the more I could see the path ahead. It wouldn't be easy, but the end was no longer a blur. It was a courtroom, and Frank would have to look at the evidence and know that this time the truth wasn't going away. The weeks leading up to the court date were a strange mix of stillness and sudden jolts of adrenaline every time my phone buzzed. Some days I could focus on small tasks, washing dishes, answering emails, trying to read, and other days my mind circled the same loop of questions about how it would feel to face Frank in a courtroom. Laura kept me grounded, reminding me to eat, dropping by with coffee, and Peter kept me sharp, drilling me on possible cross-examination questions. He told me Frank's attorney might try to twist my words, bring up unrelated arguments from years past, or imply that I had a history of exaggerating. We rehearsed calmly, countering with facts, and every time I stumbled, Peter would pause and say, "Remember, the truth is your anchor. You lived it, no one can take that away." I printed extra copies of my medical records, stored the original x-rays in a protective sleeve, and sometimes I would take them out looking at the stark white fracture line on the dark film. It was strange, but those images felt like armor, a visible map of the pain he had caused. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. My leg still ached when it was cold, and my mind kept replaying the moment his boot came down the snap that had turned my life sideways. At dawn, I dressed in a navy blazer and simple blouse, wanting to be neat but not theatrical. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my coffee hands, still until Laura arrived to drive me. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and floor polish, with the low hum of voices echoing against high ceilings. We checked in and took seats near the front. When Frank walked in 20 minutes later, his expression was somewhere between smug and cold. Janet just behind him with her chin slightly lifted and Mark trailing eyes shifting around the room. My chest tightened, but Peter leaned in and whispered, "They're not in control here. You are." When the bailiff called our case, we moved to the front. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, asked if we were ready to proceed. Peter began by presenting the evidence, starting with the x-rays. When the images lit up on the screen, there was a shift in the room, a quiet intake of breath from somewhere in the gallery, and even Frank's face tightened slightly. Peter walked the judge through the medical report, the force required to cause such a fracture, and linked it directly to my account. When it was my turn to speak, I took a deep breath and told the story without embellishment. I kept my voice steady, eyes on the judge, not on Frank, even though I could feel his glare. Then came the cross-examination. As predicted, his lawyer suggested the injury could have been from a fall or an accident, but I repeated calmly that I was standing in the dining room when Frank kicked me twice hard enough to break my leg. He tried to bring up old disagreements, implying I had a pattern of misinterpreting events. Peter objected, and the judge sustained. That small moment felt like a crack of light in the wall I'd been pushing against for years. After both sides finished, the judge said she would review the evidence and issue a decision the following week. Walking out, my body felt heavy, drained from the hours of holding steady under the weight of his presence, but lighter too, knowing I had said exactly what needed to be said. Laura hugged me tight in the hallway. Peter told me I had done everything right, and as we stepped out into the cold air, I realized that no matter what came next, the silence I had lived under for so long was already broken. The week between the hearing and the verdict stretched longer than any month I could remember. Every morning I woke with a tightness in my chest, the memory of the courtroom still vivid, the image of the x-rays glowing on the screen playing over and over in my head. I tried to keep busy folding laundry, organizing kitchen drawers, walking short distances on my still stiff leg, but no matter what I did, the thought of the judge reviewing the evidence hovered like a shadow. I replayed the expressions I had seen that day, Frank's jaw tight when the images appeared, Janet's eyes flicking away, Mark's restless shifting in his seat. I wondered if they understood yet that this time their version of events wouldn't erase mine. 2 days before the decision, Peter called to tell me the judge had requested additional clarification from the medical expert. Nothing unusual, but it made my stomach knot tighter. Laura reminded me that the more thorough the review, the harder it would be for anyone to question the outcome. On the morning of the verdict, I dressed the same as before. Neat and plain, no distractions. Laura drove us in silence, her hand resting on the console, a quiet show of support. The courthouse felt heavier than it had the week before, the walls holding the weight of years of things unsaid. Frank walked in, flanked by Janet and Mark, their faces set, but not as sure as before. We all took our seats, and when the judge entered the room, fell into a tense stillness. She summarized the case, outlining the evidence and the standard required to prove assault causing serious bodily harm. My pulse thudded harder with each point she recapped. Then she looked directly at Frank and said, "The court found beyond a reasonable doubt that he had intentionally kicked me, causing the fracture." The air shifted. Frank's face went pale. Janet's lips pressed thin. Mark stared at the table. The judge ordered community service fines and a restraining order preventing him from contacting me for 5 years. It wasn't jail, but it was public and permanent. When the gavel came down, Laura squeezed my hand hard. Relief and vindication flooded in, not because I wanted to see him punished for its own sake, but because for once, the truth had been seen and acknowledged in a way they couldn't twist. Outside, the winter air was sharp, and for the first time in years, it felt clean to breathe. In the days after the verdict, word spread quickly through the small town, carried in whispers at the grocery store over coffee at the diner in the aisles of Frank's hardware shop. People who had known us for years now looked at me differently, not with pity, but with a kind of measured respect. A few even reached out quietly, sharing their own stories of family violence hidden behind closed doors, and while some messages were little more than a simple thank you, others told me that seeing me take this public had given them the push to act for themselves. Frank and Janet stayed silent. No calls, no visits, no apology. Mark vanished from my phone entirely, his number sliding further down my contacts list like it was sinking into water. Melissa from next door told me she'd seen Frank leaving the courthouse alone one morning, his head down, a sight she said she never thought she'd witness. The restraining order meant I could finally move through my days without scanning for his presence. It was like a constant background noise had been switched off. Laura kept coming by with coffee, and my neighbor, Mrs. Dawson, started inviting me to her Sunday dinners. Her warm kitchen, a sharp contrast to the cold, careful atmosphere I'd grown up in. My leg healed slowly, the tenderness fading, but never fully gone. The scar, small but visible, was a permanent reminder of what had been done and of the line I had drawn. I kept up with therapy twice a week, unpacking years of buried hurt, learning to name the moments that had shaped me without letting them define me. There were still days when I woke with a jolt, a flash of the living room, the sound of bone snapping, but the difference was that now I could pull myself back to the present without feeling like I was drowning. I had thought that once the verdict came, I would want revenge, but what I wanted instead was distance and the peace that came with it. The absence of their voices was strange at first, like the sudden quiet after a storm. But then it became the rhythm of my days, steady and calm. For the first time in years, I could walk into my apartment without bracing for a confrontation, sleep without listening for footsteps in the hall, wake without the weight of dread curling in my stomach. The court had given me legal protection, but what I valued most was the space to rebuild a life that was mine alone. Months passed, and the distance from my family that had once felt like a wound began to feel like a wall I had built myself brick by brick, each boundary laid with intention. The noise of their constant criticism had been replaced with quiet evenings reading on the couch, tending to the small balcony garden where tomatoes grew heavy on the vine. I no longer flinched when my phone buzzed because the people who had my number now were the ones who used it to check in, not to tear me down. Frank's presence in town was diminished. I heard he avoided places where he might see me, his once unshakable posture, now marked by glances over his shoulder. Janet kept to her circles, still telling her version of events to anyone who would listen, but without me there to absorb the impact her reach had shrunk. At work, I took on more hours at the library, eventually being offered a promotion to branch coordinator. The raise meant I could finally replace the old couch Frank had once thrown me onto years ago in anger. Selling it felt like shedding an old skin. My therapist called it reclaiming my space, and she was right. Every change I made, from a fresh coat of paint in the hallway to a new lock on the front door, felt like proof that this was my life now and they no longer had keys to it. Some nights I still dreamed of the living room, the boot, the snap, but I would wake with my hand resting on the small scar along my shin and remember that it was not a weakness but a mark of survival. The blog post I had written about my case began circulating online, reaching people I would never meet, and each message of thanks reminded me that telling the truth could be its own kind of resistance. On the 1-year anniversary of the night Frank broke my leg, I drove to the courthouse not for a hearing, but to stand outside and remember. The spring air was crisp, the trees just starting to bloom, and as I looked up at the building's stone facade, I felt the weight of everything that had happened settle into place. No longer raw, but etched into me like the small scar along my shin. I thought about the girl I had been before that night, the one who measured her words and movements to avoid conflict, who swallowed pain in silence because it seemed safer than speaking. She was gone, replaced by someone who had stood in a courtroom and told the truth with the evidence in her hand, someone who had chosen to face the fallout rather than carry the weight of being quiet. The verdict had been more than a legal win. It had been a line drawn in the open one that said my safety was not negotiable, my voice not disposable. I knew there would still be whispers in town, still people who took Frank's side, but their opinions no longer had power over me. I left the courthouse that day without looking back, went home, and watered the tomato plants on my balcony, the sun warm on my shoulders, the city noise drifting up from the street below. Justice had been served in a courtroom, but the real victory was here in this quiet moment, in the knowledge that I had taken back my life piece by piece, and that no one, not even my own family, could take it from me again.